everyone for coming. It's good to see everybody. I know it's difficult to get out of work for some people, but appreciate the effort people have made. This is the third event I've been asked to take part in to promote the book. And it's good to be in an environment where I've worked before and where a lot of research on Northern Ireland is obviously carried out in the archives, which are very important. Obviously, I'm here to promote the book. You see copies of it up there. That's a photograph from a talk that I gave in Shankill Road Library about 2 weeks ago now, and I think there was about 80 people there. And last week I had the official launch in the Uvf Welders Club in East Belfast, and I think there was about 110 people. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm boasting, but I'm just glad to be able to say that the book sold over 400 copies. It's only been out since August, and that's despite some bookshops not actually stocking it yet. So I'm really pleased at that, and Liverpool University Press have been brilliant in that regard in terms of supporting the project and distributing the book. So basically, why study this area? Well, for me, as somebody who's into music and football and youth culture and the Tartan Gangs in particular are a perfect vehicle by which to provide a fresh study of the emergence of Loyalist paramilitarism in the early 1970s. It addresses common misperceptions. Immediately, one of those that I can talk about is the Bay City Rollers. The Tartan Gangs were not based on the Bay City Rollers. And yeah, like I've mentioned, investigate the role of youth subcultures at the start of the Troubles. So, although there's been little substantial material written about the Tartan Gangs, there have been 2 books published that are important in terms of analysing them in the context of youth culture and sectarianism in Northern Ireland. So the one on the left is a very popular book, Acts of Union by Desmond, and he was more interested in how Kick the Pope band culture sort of tied in with the Tartans. And he mentions a wee bit about the Woodstock Tartans, but a lot of it's based in Derry, Londonderry. And the book on the right, Richard Jenkins, who was a social worker in, as he calls it, Ballyhightown, which as far as I know is Rathcoole. And he talks about the Tartan Gangs, but again, this is the late 70s. It's really, I think at that stage, the Tartan Gangs are it's more a sort of bit of graffiti on the wall, rather than the real, authentic Tartan Gangs that I'd be looking at. But it's still 2 very important works which have played a huge part in influencing me. But the biggest influence on my decision to write about loyalism is this man, Peter Taylor, who is a very well-respected journalist who covered the Troubles in Northern Ireland and has come back continuously to revisit the people he interviewed. Now, Loyalists, the book, and the documentary series, which was from 1999, Peter Taylor got access to Loyalist paramilitaries from the top level down, and he'd already done a documentary on the IRA, the provisional IRA, called Provos. So, in an interview with The Guardian, he said, at the time, he said, when we came to record the interviews, they were even more candid than those I had done for Provos, not least because Loyalists are refreshingly untutored in the media, and unlike most Provos, accept personal responsibility for what they did. So loyalism is separated from that narrative of the overall political struggle. In the interviews, Peter Taylor captured people take individual responsibility. And it's the same in the Guardian review of that programme, where the reviewer said that he was shocked by the candour of the loyalists who were interviewed. And Eddie Kinner, who was one of the people actually interviewed for the documentary, said that again Peter Taylor came and spoke to the participants afterwards and said that he was absolutely flabbergasted at how open they were about their sectarian attitudes at the time. So that's book signing that I attended at the time in Waterstones when it was in just beside Castlecourt before it unfortunately burnt down. So got a chance to meet Peter Taylor, and that obviously left a lasting impression on me. But the big thing in the Loyalist book that left an impression on me was this quote, and it says, "The Tartans became a familiar sight in Belfast, with their knee-length blue jeans and boffer boots, marching with their tartan scarves alongside the Loyalist bands." And he says, Eddie Kinner used to travel to school at the time with a rucksack bearing the initials SYT YCV and UVF. I asked him what they stood for, and Eddie says, Shankill Young Tartan, Young Citizen Volunteers and Ulster Volunteer Force. I think that was the route that I travelled. So, the origins of the tartan, again, when I was speaking the last couple of nights I was out, one of the books that I've read recently is about the Gangs of Dundee by a guy called Gary Robertson. And what he says is that although he's lived in Dundee all his life, and he interviewed these guys who were in gangs in Dundee in the 1970s, all the gangs in Dundee were identified by cycling jerseys. So if any of you are familiar with cycling, or even sort of the Bradley Wiggins, Fred Perry range at the moment, you'll see that there's a lot of different motifs on the cycling jerseys with the zip-up collar, and that's how they identified themselves and where they were from in Dundee. Now, to find out how that started, Gary just had to say that's one for the guys to sort out over a friendly pint themselves. And it's the same with the tartan, but one of the most credible, well, two of the credible influences came not from the 1970s but the 1960s. People were travelling over Rangers games at the time, and Rangers at that stage weren't seen as a dominant sort of symbol of Ulster identity that they are now, or loyalism. They were still very much Scotland's pride in the 1960s. Although social attitudes were changing in the 1960s, Rangers were still seen as flying the flag for Scottish sport. And in that respect, the Lion Rampant and the tartan was still very much associated with Rangers, and that would have been transported back here. The other is the Glasgow Gangs that were encountered when young lads from here went over to Glasgow to watch Rangers. And they would have heard about these gangs, which of course James Patrick, the pseudonym that the sociologist used to write this book, he went undercover with the Glasgow Gang and wrote this study. So just to read from the book very briefly, this is one of the most credible explanations for the tartan that I could come across, and it involves two of the interviewees. One was Jim Tipping, who eventually joined the Red Hand Commando, and the other was a fella called Dyer, who was never involved in paramilitarism. So, other matters away from the political turbulence consumed young Protestants at this time. Jim Tipping was a fervent Rangers supporter and states that it was during regular trips to Glasgow in the late 1960s that the tartan scarf, which would eventually become popular with Loyalist youth gangs in the early 1970s, was adopted by young men from Belfast. He says, I used to go over to Ibrox all the time. It was to do with the Rangers matches. There was all different tartans. You had the blue tartan, the McGregor tartan and all. Bo Dyer was a teenager living in the Shankill in the late 1960s. He recalls, I was starting to go to Linfield games with Frankie and Spider and Roy Stewart and Devil. And he remembers that we were fervent Linfield supporters, absolute hooligans as well. This was around 1967, and some of the lads who followed Linfield in the area became known as the Shankill Young Team, like the young teams described in James Patrick's book. But like Tipping and hundreds of other young lads from the Shankill, Dyer and Frankie Curry were also Rangers supporters. Bo Dyer remembers that he and Curry once found themselves in a gift shop in Glasgow where they stole a box which contained Burberry-style scarves. He handed them out to friends in Belfast and remembers that one evening, on entering the Crown Snooker Hall in the Shankill, someone shouted, "Here's the tartan coming." It changed from Shankill Young Team to Shankill Young Tartan. So there's a photograph there with some of the people that Bo mentions on the way to the Linfield match in 1970. And again, this event in 1970 was to be a catalyst for serious rioting, which at the time the nascent paramilitary groupings were obviously watching. And Billy Hutchinson's talked a lot about how he was talent spotted during this period by the UVF as somebody who was prominent in a riot situation. But if you look at the Shankill just as one area, four prominent tartan. There's the Shankill Young Tartan, which was the overall largest group. There was also the Rats, who came from the Black Pad, the Orange Field from Highfield, the West Circular area, and the Ulster Boot Boys. So even within one area like the Shankill, you had four groups vying for territory. And it's in 1971 that this sort of issue comes to the fore in the press. And just to read from the newsletter briefly and about an article that was published at the time. In April 1971, a newsletter headline loudly declared that Shankill gang war is a new threat to Belfast peace. The article stated that a group of traders in the area had come together to complain to police about the lawlessness that was becoming rife particularly after dark. The traders had threatened to withhold their rates and protested police inaction on the matter. While the police admitted that the gangs, the Rats and the Tartan, existed, they reiterated that no formal complaint had been taken against them, nor had they broken any laws. The newsletter further reported that the two gangs used derelict houses in Malvern Street in the Lower Shankill as headquarters. An angry resident stated that the gangs were young hooligans who fought pitched battles among themselves. He said, "Last week I saw members of the two gangs fighting in a vicious and cruel manner. They used belts and knuckle dusters, and I saw one young boy knocked to the ground and about 3 other youths started kicking him in the face. Just then, a couple of men arrived on the scene and went to the boy's aid. When they asked him who was responsible, he refused to answer. From what I can gather, they have a code of silence and he mustn't squeal." So look at the next slide, which is a picture from quite later on. It's from June 1972 in Carrick. You see the Tartan marching through Carrick town. And to give you an idea of what was going on at that stage, I'll just turn to page 108 of the book, which refers to a year or two previously. But it shows that there was a worry in Stormont even at this stage about this new youth culture and youth movement. And in June 1971, shortly after the newsletter article and during the early weeks of the traditional marching season, concerns began to be raised about the presence of the Tartans at orange parades and demonstrations. In the week following the White Rock Parade, John Taylor, Minister for Home Affairs at the time, responded to accusations by nationalist MPs that elements of the Orange Order had been intent on causing trouble in interface areas during the parade. Taylor said, "The Honourable Member for Falls may also be seeking for a general condemnation of parades, or wish to draw attention to the unruly elements which accompany some orange parades. I think that it should be emphasised that almost without exception, orange parades are well disciplined and orderly, and the young hooligans who sometimes attach themselves to a parade are to be condemned in the strongest possible manner." To which Austin Curry responded, "I listened with interest to the Minister's reference to what he described as the young hooligans who accompanied the orange parade on this occasion. I wonder if it is absolutely correct to describe these people as young hooligans. Accompanying this parade was a large number of young men in blue denims. I am told that a section of the parade referred to my honourable friend, the Member for Falls, Mr. Paddy Devlin. These young men, numbering hundreds, attempted to goose step and behave in a disciplined military way. I presume they could be called true blues. These are militants on the unionist side, and they accompanied this march for the express purpose of ensuring that if there was any trouble, they would be able to go into action as a type of military force. There is more than young hooliganism involved in this." So there was an emerging panic about the Tartans in particular, and Curry, I think, accurately identified that there was more than simple hooliganism to the behaviour that was emerging at this time. So, I mean, this photo, which is taken by, at the time, March 1972, it was taken by an amateur photographer called Billy Badge from Donegal Pass. And Billy kindly allowed me to use the photograph for the book. Billy was an amateur photographer whose mum had given him what at that time would have been a better camera than what most people would have had. And what he did was he went round and snapped just general day-to-day life, like at that time day-to-day life was explosions, riots and that type of thing. And he got a photo of this, which is Shankill Tartan. You can see the flag at the front. And they're marching up past the gasworks, which are still, you know, some of the buildings are still there on the Ormo Road, down near Havelock House. And they're marching to the Vanguard rally in Ormo Park. And one of the poignant things, I think, which is contained in the prologue to the book, is that on this same day, that hundreds of young Loyalist men were marching to hear Bill Craig talk about liquidating the enemy. At the same time, a lot of these guys who had been T-Rex fans, on the same day in Wembley Pool Hall, young men who were from similar backgrounds, albeit without the political context, were queuing up to watch T-Rex play their biggest ever gig to that point. So there you see in Ormo Park, there's somebody wearing the tartan scarf, somebody else carrying a flag. Again, it's very vivid and evocative of what the mood was like at the time among young people. But again, I just want to read from the book to give you a flavour of what was going on in Ormo Park that day, and how there was a mixture of sort of high political feeling, but also a degree of maybe naivety at the same time. One rally at Ormeau Park in Belfast on 18th of March 1972, which I have to say was just slightly before Stormont was prorogued, so there was a lot of uncertainty and fear in the Loyalist community that the Parliament was going to be usurped and taken over by the British government with direct rule. So this this rally attracted between 60 and 80,000 Loyalists and could be considered the visual apex of Protestant discontentment at the political and security situation in Northern Ireland. Similar to the other provincial vanguard rallies, the Ormeau Park rally was a malevolent, menacing affair full of foreboding political rhetoric. Bill Craig, stood atop a podium and stated that there can be no compromise or concession to the enemy that assails our province today. We must build up the dossiers on the men and women who are a menace in this country. Because one day, ladies and gentlemen, if the politicians fail, it may be our job to liquidate the enemy. In the crowd and marshalling the speakers at Ormeau Park, as you've seen, were the Tartans. They had come from all across Belfast to hear the latest Loyalist messiah. In the Sunday News the following day, a reporter described the intoxicating atmosphere at the rally as being like the 12th, a family reunion and the football match of the year, all rolled into one. The reporter further stated that small knots of tartan gangs clustered here and there, resplendent in their tartan scarves, bleach-faded denims and big boots. I came to show I'll be shoulder to shoulder all the way, said one lad of 14. Not another inch. The boys around him echoed his pledge. I came here because my friends came, said a boy of about 10, with starting candour. So, shortly after around the same time, actually it's April 1972, a newsletter journalist goes on to the Shankill and gets this fantastic photograph of two young Shankill Tartans with their tattoos. The one on the left, which was the inspiration for the book cover designed by my friend Ian Turner, has a simple red hand with the SYT. The other is more intricate and has the tartan clan pattern, the crown and Shankill Young Tartan. So again, as a social document of the time, that's fascinating to give an insight into what was going on. This again is another one from May 1972. Protestant violence, not summed up by men in masks or hoods or the UDA on the march, but by the Tartan. And the Tartan Gangs, I suppose, were the visual vanguard of Loyalist militancy at the time. And that's later on, that's the 7th of May 1972, after there had been a number of assassinations. So it was still clear in people's minds that the Tartan were the force to be feared. And again, there's a riot at the end of April 1972 when one of the Tartan members is shot during a riot with the Republicans in the Short Strand. Guy Sandy Rice was shot in the leg. And shortly afterwards, John McCaig on the right, who publishes Loyalist News, and there's a lot of material about Loyalist News and the sort of agitation that McCaig was behind. He was the figurehead of the Red Hand Commando at the time. He put the Tartan on the cover with this pencil drawing, and basically this is around the same time, May 1972. The Tartan were very much seen as the defenders, as Ulster's last stand, basically. So I just want to briefly put on a documentary that Max Hastings recorded at the time, which gives an idea. It was recorded shortly after this riot, and it gives an insight into how the Tartans viewed themselves, the Woodstock Tartan, and also how maybe the community viewed them as well. So I'll just turn to this briefly.
You silenced it. And click the silence button.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, it should be
on the video.
It should be up.
See?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
They come to play their music and meet their girls.
Thanks, Tommy.
No problem.
They're almost all between 16 and 21 years old. Blue denims are their uniform, and they call themselves Tartans to mark the link with Scotland that runs so strong throughout the Ulster Protestant community. Here in the club, they're kept peacefully busy. But it's once they get out on the streets that the chance of trouble follows. The authorities regard them as yet another major hazard to Belfast's prospects for peace. but the Tartans claim to see themselves as the guardians of the Protestant areas against Catholic attack.
An ordinary street gang in England is just there to create disturbances and vandalise, wreck property. We're there to defend our area against attacks by our IRA gangs.
George and Harry are two young Tartans, like so many other people in the Belfast ghettos, unwilling to be identified. But they like to claim that their gangs have now become the defenders of their area against Catholic attack.
And in the course of IRA gangs attacking our area, we have to put up barricades, and it's just unfortunate that somebody's car has to be used. Well, it has to be used. We have to keep them out any way we can, and by any means we can. But there will come a day when we'll not defend, because we're getting shot down now defending. And there was a Negro was shot there about 3 months ago, and he just said 2 weeks before he died, if I can't live like a man, I want to die like one. And that's the way we feel. They're not letting us live like men, so therefore we'd be better off attacking them and dying like men.
The trouble is here that the enemy are always so close. If you're feeling curious about some political move, some new concession to the other side, there are so many tempting targets for reprisal just across the street. Down here in East Belfast, in a sea of loyalists, there's the isolated Catholic pocket of Short Strand. The Protestant areas here have had more than their fair shares of bombing and shooting. Every morning they wake up and look across the street at the very community they may be blaming for the latest round of trouble. In the light of this, it's less surprising that they don't seem too bothered about anything the Tartans may get up to. Well, where's the borderline lie, George?
This is the borderline here. The road is the borderline to this area. And the other side of that road is all Roman Catholics, and where you're standing on is all.
Well, what are you trying to do yourselves?
Well, when IRA mobs come out and attack this Protestant area, we have to beat them back, because the soldiers won't be able to seem to do this.
You lived in this area all your life, George?
Yeah.
If you had a complete choice, would you go on living in this area all your life, George?
At the minute I would, because they need us here to protect them against the Roman Catholics.
Harry, would you?
Well, I'm here to defend our part of town, you know, that's what we've been doing, you know. So I stay here until Ulster's passing, sort of thing, you know.
The trouble is that in the ghettos, the Tartans are given every encouragement to believe everything they say about the respectability of their own activities. All the people who in any other society might be trying to talk them out of trouble, in East Belfast seem to be backing them all the way. What do you think about the Tartans yourself?
I think they're a great bunch of boys.
The police suddenly so unpopular here, because in the old days it used to be everybody wanting the police in and the army out.
Police aren't unpopular here, just happened last month. They turned on the Tartans after the Vanguard rally last Wednesday night for no reason at all. The boys weren't doing anything.
What is it that makes the Tartans, I mean there have always been street gangs in Belfast. What is it that makes the Tartans any different from any of the others?
These are our boys. Weren't in this area, wouldn't be down at all. These are our boys of tomorrow. That's what it is.
The police turned on the Tartan. It wasn't them that started the rioting here at all.
We depend on the Tartans
For what?
for defend us. After all, they're standing at night, round the corners, the police comes along. They'll say, move on, but where are they going to?
The Tartans are only the start of it.
What happens next?
It'll come to the whole Protestant population and have to come out and do what they're doing to get anything in the country.
The police and the troops who have to handle the Tartans now find their usual roles in Protestant areas reversed. The police, who in the past have been far more popular than the army, are accused of ruthless tactics and the manner in which they've driven the gangs back from the border of Catholic areas. They and the soldiers have to bear the brunt of the frustrations of the whole Protestant community, young and old, who bitterly resent the current kid-glove approach in handling the Catholics and the flow of concessions from the Protestants' hated enemy. There's a constant effort to use the RUC on the streets whenever possible to bring back some semblance of normal policing. The Tartans' complaint is that the police only really crack down on the Protestant side of the fence. But the answer to that, of course, is that no one will risk using the police with their batons against a Catholic crowd when there's so often a gunman in the background. In the end, even routine hooliganism has to be handled as a military problem with troops on hand, as long as even the smallest child with a rock can claim he's a soldier for his sect. Come the night, and the Tartans are out. In ones and twos, in groups that can build into hundreds in a flash if there's trouble, they walk the streets, relishing their newfound local respectability as the accepted keepers. All young gangs in all cities have always fancied that they were heroes. But here, there are even adults who are prepared to call them that too.
I think we'll end up in civil war, which is a thing that we don't want to happen, is a civil war. Because innocent people get killed in civil wars.
But why do you think it's going to be civil war?
Because they're pushing the Protestant people back, so they're going to be pushed back no further.
One of the worst problems on both sides of the fence in Ulster is that in the Belfast ghettos you can get away with almost anything by using the blanket excuse that it's for the cause. The Tartans aren't really a bit more notable than the sort of street gangs you find in the slums of any English city. It's just that here they've found an enemy their parents aren't too unhappy to see them fighting. The same social problems that cause juvenile delinquency anywhere else in the world, combined with a political frustration they can use to dignify their feuds and their boredom. And it's this false status that makes them the threat they are.
So as you see, that sort of crystallises everything I'm trying to talk about. Sometimes a documentary can show it better. You know, the footage is fascinating in terms of demonstrating what the mood was in the Loyalist community at that time. And just to sort of underline that, say Brezhnev's nothing to do with this talk, but on the front of the Time magazine, which is obviously a global magazine, in the issue in May 1972 at the same time, there's this article which came across a number of years ago, Teddy Boys with Tartans, and there are journalists making the same point, that any other time, as you did have in Belfast, these would just be street gangs and nobody would bat an eyelid, but because of the prevailing political circumstances, things were very different. And again, Jim Tipping, who I interviewed, was interviewed for this Time magazine piece, and it says, a typical Tartan gang member is Jim Tipping, a long-haired lad of 18 who has a crest of Protestant banners tattooed upon his scarred right arm. The scar is a relic of an IRA gunshot that Tipping suffered while walking down a Belfast street weeks ago. Tipping's gang, the Shankle Tartans, has hundreds of members who spend much of their time lolling on street corners and shouting anti-Catholic slogans on Saturday afternoons. I mean, I think they're underplaying what the Tartan were doing at that stage somewhat by saying just loll on street corners. And maybe something that illustrates that is the fact that Jim was interviewed as a Tartan member, but at the same time he's second from back in that photo of the Red Hand Commando shortly a few weeks later. And this is during the no-go areas in Loyalist communities that were set up as a response to what was going on in Republican areas. The guy in the middle, behind the guy with sunglasses and long hair, that's Plum Smith, who I think a lot of you would know, who sadly passed away this year. And a couple of the other guys in that photograph I interviewed. But it just shows that, you know, maybe the media weren't always getting it right at that stage in terms of what the Tartan were doing, or what the crossover between the Tartan and the Loyalist paramilitaries was, and how intense it was. But in reality, there was already people embarking on serious activities. This is a photo from later on in the year. It's from September 1972, and it's from Grove Park. I think the interesting thing here is the guy second from the left, and one of the guys who'd gone through the Tartan was looking at that photo, and as he just said, it just shows you the mishmash of identities at that stage. By all intents and purposes, a UDA uniform with a peaked cap, but also a UVF hat badge and a Tartan scarf around the waistband. So there's a lot of crossover going on at that stage, and that's one thing. When I was talking to guy Billy McQuiston, Twister, I'm sure a lot of you know, up in Highfield, he was in the Ulster Boot Boys and then later the UDA. He made the point that the rivalry between paramilitary factions wasn't there to the same extent as it would be now or later on. There's a lot of crossover and dual membership, which wasn't a problem for some people. And in the background with the bomber jackets and berets there, you can see the Red Hand Commando, very identifiable. So I just want to read from the book again. Again, this is Uvf Funeral, but this shows the Uvf uniform, the idea of the men in black with sunglasses, cap comforters and leather jacket. But it just to talk briefly about Eddie Kinner. Again, there's this perception that people transition into the paramilitaries, and you know, there's a feeling that young men are sort of taken advantage of by shadowy older figures. But often it was a desire among young men to do what they thought was right, and you saw that represented in the documentary. So, as I say, although there was a large degree of crossover between the Loyalist paramilitary groupings in 1972, the fighting between Loyalist youth gangs continued and began to increasingly reflect tensions between UDA and UVF constituencies, which often overlapped in districts and even fights. Fights between young Protestants were sometimes in danger of spilling over into intracommunal paramilitary feuds. It was the fallout from one such altercation that led Eddie Kinner to being recruited by the YCV. During a disco in the Alliance Avenue area of North Belfast, there was a by now typically ferocious fight involving two Tartan members from Agnes Street in the Shankill and some of the Ulster Boot Boys from Highfield, in which the latter came off much the worse. The Agnes Street Tartans were YCV members, while the two Boot Boys were in the UDA. The next week, UDA members from the Highfield and Glencairn estates at the top of the Shankill laid an ambush for the Shankill Tartans on their return from the Alliance Avenue disco. Although Kinner was unharmed during the revenge attack, he was eventually apprehended while walking home later that night. At that stage I lived in Highfield. As I crossed the Ballygo, 50 of these fuckers jumped out of the corner of Lower Glencairn, and I heard one of them shout, "There's one of them." They were baiting each other to bait me. I crawled through a hedge of a garden, and one of them told me to either stay at a Highfield or stay off the Shankill. I crawled up and made my way home with a broken nose, black eyes, face unrecognisable. Kinner had strong family connections with the UVF, and recalls that while he was in hospital the day after he received this beating, there was a heated summit meeting between the organisation and the UDA in the Greater Shankill area. The UVF and the UDA had a big powwow in the Highfield Rangers over what had taken place, and it got hot and heavy. It could have potentially led to a feud. Andy Turry was involved, and the UDA from the Shankill were involved. Two of my uncles were there, as were the UVF military commander and a provost marshal. It wasn't long after that I was invited into the YCV. At that kind of time, that's the way you got into the UVF. You were approached and asked to join it. So I had interpreted it as I had been selected. But looking back, it's a result of my uncle's involvement, that they better get me in and under the protection of the UVF properly. They couldn't come down hard in the UDA, but once I was a member of the YCV, they could have responded a wee bit more vicious. So again, this gives you an idea later on of the recruitment policy of the YCV. Still a very secretive group, but advertising in their journal Combat, they're asking Loyalist teenagers to join Ulster's only trained and disciplined cadet force. So that was still the rhetoric that was being messaged out to young Loyalists. So again, this photo's in the book, and it's Dusty Spence, Eddie Kinner and Billy Hutchinson. And I think there's quite an interesting passage from the book which ties in with what Tony Novosel did in terms of looking at the political attempts by Loyalists to communicate some more progressive initiatives from the jail in the mid-70s that were ignored or ahead of their time. So to give you context, Eddie was blown up in a bomb which he placed in a Catholic bar in Greencastle, and when he was taken to hospital he was transferred to Musgrave Military Hospital, and he was keen to deny that he'd been the person who planted the explosion. He was keen to state that he'd walked past the bar to try and beat the charge, and that he just got caught up in the explosion. So like so many other Loyalist paramilitaries during this period, Kinner was to be represented by Desmond Bowl. Despite this, he was keen to deny all charges. Forensics were there. I couldn't deny being there, but there was nothing to say I wasn't just walking past and caught in the incident. I was prepared to fight it. The alibi Kinner had planned to use eventually fell through, and on the day of the trial, Bowl was surprised to learn that he was nevertheless still planning to plead not guilty. Kinner states that Bowl's whole attitude was to put the frighteners, to challenge me. He threw down photos of Geordie Brown on the morgue slab, who was one of the YCV members who'd been blown up. I'd love to have got up and tore his head fucking clean off his shoulders. There's no kind of advice or help. As one of the young Turks who had come into the YCV through the Tartan gang culture, Kinner was dismayed to find that he had next to no support from such a prominent loyalist figure. Prior to the arrest of Spence and his co-accused in 1966, loyalists were unfamiliar with being incarcerated for their actions in defending their social and political ideals. For Kinner, arrest and prosecution came as something as an eye-opener. He recalls that there was an element of realisation that he would be going away for a long time, but also that there was elements of defiance. Whenever we were sentenced, we gave clenched fist salutes. I shouted up the YCV. The crowd in the gallery started chanting UVF. It was full of YCVs. Kinner's later sense of doubt about why he was being incarcerated was tempered by a fear that such thoughts were somewhat treacherous. He says, "I was already questioning it. The whole thing that is abusing me here is the British Crown, yet my actions are wanting to retain that." However, on coming under the influence of Gusty Spence, Kinner realised that such doubts could be openly expressed and debated with other like-minded loyalists. It's only whenever you went into the compounds on Long Cash and Gusty encouraged those questions openly that you weren't frowned upon. You felt that you could discuss and question the system that you were governed by and identify the faults in it and flaws in it. While you may have wanted to retain the union, there are flaws in it that you want to fix. So again, just to briefly talk about the research, the challenges are very obvious. The historical inquiries team, at the time I started off, had sent letters to some of the people I'd interviewed asking them to cooperate in certain cases. One of the people I interviewed, Bobby Rogers, was rearrested under that legislation and jailed for a sectarian murder, or his part in it, based on forensic evidence. The Boston College tapes, which overlapped somewhat with the HET at the time, people became very wary and didn't really want to talk openly. One of the people I was actually meant to interview, Winky Ray, is obviously undergoing possible prosecution based on what he might have said on the Boston tapes. But on a more prosaic level, being an outsider, I'm not from the Loyalist community. I don't have those political sympathies. I don't have any political sympathies, to be honest, and maybe that's what helped at the end of the day. Being an outsider, people ask, why would you want to look at this subject? But it goes back to what I was saying. It's a fascinating subject. It's been underdeveloped, it's been under-researched, and I think there's a lot more to be said about it. I think academia can often be a sort of challenge as well. I think academia generally is more sympathetic to studies of republicanism, and as Steve Bruce, the professor in Aberdeen University, he felt that was maybe because more academics were Republicans. But the quote from an article that a friend of mine, Richard Reed, who did a book about paramilitary loyalism, he did an article about research in sensitive subjects, and he talked about this, and he said, "I encountered resistance from a small number of peers who were unwilling to accept complexities or nuances to the academic record of loyalism. I was perplexed to find that there is still a tendency within some quarters to dismiss the possibility of nuance in loyalism." And he goes on to explain that he was accused of endorsing loyalist violence by not being critical enough. So that's all the same sort of stuff I've encountered, despite the fact that Tony's got a book out that looks at the progressive nature of loyalist political initiatives in the mid-70s, and other works which have defied the myths based on fact. But still, there's a feeling that loyalism shouldn't be taken seriously in academia. But this doesn't help with the tabloid obsession with loyalism, which I became sort of victim of a couple of weeks ago when I refused to do an interview with Jim McDowell, and he published this article. So after a number of years of doing archival research, in-depth sensitive interviews, trying to treat the topic with some sort of credibility, he wrote about the book saying, he obviously liked the book, but the top headline in the first 3 paragraphs, which everybody reads, he said, "Putting the tail on terrorists. My time with Sunday Word helped me pen book." Now, not only is that wrong, but it's also dangerous given the stories that the Sunday Word have written about loyalist paramilitaries, because it looked like almost like doing a sort of Donnie Brasco and sort of going undercover. And then all of a sudden I'd been exposed as a Sunday World journalist. That's completely untrue. I did work experience with the Sunday World through school. I was sent there because Jim McDowell's son went to Methody at the time, and that's where we were sent. I did one story, and it was about coffins for animals. Jim wanted me to do about the story with this company in England. They made coffins for pets. So the only person I interviewed was Jerry Anderson, who'd just come off his radio show at that stage. He spent 20 minutes arguing with himself whether he would buy a coffin for his dog. And in the end, he came to the conclusion that he probably would because the dog was part of the family. But again, that completely, it's a mistruth because Jim says that I shadowed the Loyalist paramilitaries that I eventually interviewed, which is complete nonsense. So again, that doesn't help. And as he said to me on the phone, he said, "You know what my readers are like with loyalism?" And I said yes, which is why I didn't want to do the interview. Again, PRONI is brilliant resources at the start, but I have sympathy for the staff in PRONI, having worked on the other side of the counter, because there's a flood of these requests coming in now from people like myself, academic researchers, victims groups, quite rightly, families of victims, and also in the case of Plum, who was representing a number of loyalists who've been interned, loyalist groupings. People want to get the truth of what went on in the past, and some of the stuff's quite anodyne. I requested this court file relating to Stevie McRae, who was a member of the Red Hand Commando, who was arrested for a shooting in October 1972. And this is basically his court file, which I think it's important to get this sort of material, even if it is redacted. There's good reason why it's redacted. The newspaper articles tell you so much, documentaries tell you so much, people themselves can tell you so much, but it's trying to see the other view, the view of the victims, people who witnessed these events, and also the police. And it was difficult enough getting those files, and I don't blame anybody in PRONI. It's just the sort of departmental rules change, this, that and the other. And I know how hard the guys in PRONI work at having to redact and re-redact stuff. Some of the material I did request were internment files for people who deceased, and I'm still waiting on those a few years later. And I'm not going to talk about the legacy and that type of thing of the troubles right now, but I suppose transparency, even if it is dirty and it's uncomfortable for people, it'll give us a more rounded truth of what happened, maybe on both sides or all sides. But to get away from that, the opportunities were obvious as well, and I've talked about them. It was the first attempt to look at the Tartan subculture based on first-hand stories. People were really helpful in this regard, and it was like Robert Niblock, for example, who's written a play based on his experiences of being in the Tartan Gang, which played to sold-out audiences as part of the Cathedral Quarter Arts Festival. He initially told me his story, but then as a member of the Tartan who went into the Red Hand Commando, he introduced me to former Red Hand members from the Shankill, like Jim Tipping and Ronnie McCulloch, who never contributed to any study. So in the printed word, this is the first time these stories have been told by the people themselves. And there was a desire among loyalists to see an incredible account emerge, something that wasn't like what the Jim McDowells of this world would write. So oral history goes back to what we're talking about with Boston and the HET. Previously thought of as an amateur history, but it's becoming an important discipline now, thankfully. And I know that the Stormont House Agreement tried to write something in about getting an oral record of the conflict. Obviously that will be more difficult now because people aren't immune from prosecution. So it's contentious in post-conflict societies, no matter where we are. In Northern Ireland, some of these events are still very much alive in people's minds, and there's people still seeking truth of what happened to their loved ones. But I think it's important in recording the community's memory and constructing the social history. I mean, I think some people are often surprised when I go in, and I suppose it's a sort of train spotting aspect of where you want to get an actual idea of the layout. I mean, for one of the places where the Red Hand would have met was the Bricklayer's Arms in the Shankill. And when I was interviewing people, I wanted to get an idea of what it was like, what the layout was, and you know what the, because that's where they did their training on combat training. So they described the upper bar would have had bus seats all across the floor, so that they could stifle the noise of the thumps of people being thrown across people's shoulders from the drinkers below. But it's all those wee details that go into the book that keep that memory alive in terms of just the small details, which I know not everyone finds interesting, but a lot of people do. So again, just to conclude, future directions. I've tried to finish off my book the way Tony finished off his book and open it for other researchers to come through. I mean, I'd possibly like to do more work on loyalism, but I think it's imperative that loyalists tell their own story, as Plum Smith did. I mean, Plum's book was brilliant. It maybe wasn't what we expected it to be. A lot of us who are interested in loyalism, it maybe didn't go into the detail that we wanted. It maybe wasn't exactly, but that's because we highly anticipated it. But still, the fact that Plum took the initiative and did it is the most important thing. And other people have talked about doing their stories, but again, that'll be difficult because of the prevailing circumstances. Again, on the right there, you see that's a scene from Robert Niblock's play Tartan, based on his experience. Just shows you how the naivety of youth transists into loyalist paramilitarism. I think one of the things that just like to end on, women, female narratives are important. I think in terms of republicanism, the female narrative's always been at the forefront, which is healthy. In loyalism, it hasn't been so much, maybe more on the UDA side, but specifically in the UVF. We know for a fact there was a lot of female volunteers. It's important to capture their stories. I think there were more than just auxiliaries or nurses, as one person said to me. So I think there's much more to be told about loyalism in both academic studies and more general historical studies. So thank you very much.